The Montana Territory of 1883 held both promise and peril for those seeking a new beginning. The sweeping plains and towering mountains created a landscape of breathtaking beauty that masked the unforgiving nature beneath. In this frontier wilderness, where civilization clung to scattered settlements like moss to stone, survival demanded strength, wisdom, and sometimes unexpected allies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the extraordinary story of Elizabeth Caldwell, a widowed schoolteacher whose faith in humanity was shattered by betrayal, and Daniel Redfeather, a Lakota hunter whose knowledge of two worlds made him an outsider to both. Their unlikely connection, forged in the crucible of Montana's most brutal winter in decades, would challenge the boundaries that divided their worlds and reveal the power of compassion when all hope seemed lost. The first snowfall of November 1883 came earlier than anyone expected, dusting the rooftops of Riverdale with a deceptive gentleness that belied the harshness to follow. Most residents welcomed the sight, gathering by windows with steaming cups of coffee, children pointing excitedly at the transformed landscape. Winter in Montana meant hardship, certainly, but the people of Riverdale had prepared well. Their root cellars stocked with preserves, wood piles stacked high against cabin walls, and community bonds strengthened through harvest festivals and barn raisings throughout the autumn months. All except for the modest cabin at the edge of town, where Elizabeth Caldwell stood alone, watching the snowflakes through a window that already showed signs of neglect. At 32, Beth's face retained a quiet beauty that grief had not yet erased, though shadows had taken residence beneath her hazel eyes. Her chestnut hair, usually pinned neatly for her teaching duties, hung loose around her shoulders as she absently traced frost patterns forming on the glass. 2 months, she whispered to the empty room, counting the days since she had laid Thomas to rest beneath the cottonwood tree behind the church. The typhoid that had swept through Riverdale in late summer had claimed 6 lives, including her husband of 7 years. The community had mourned together, supported one another through the crisis until the funerals ended and life resumed its normal rhythms for everyone but Beth. The small schoolhouse where she had taught remained closed, Mayor Preston having declared that a proper male educator would arrive by spring. Her position, supposedly temporary when they'd arrived from Pennsylvania 3 years ago, had become entirely expendable now that she was a widow without Thomas's carpentry income to supplement the town's meager teaching stipend. A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Beth quickly smoothed her skirt and tucked her hair behind her ears, making a futile attempt to appear composed before opening the door. "Mrs. Caldwell." Mayor Preston stood on her porch, his substantial frame blocking most of the view behind him. Snow collected on the brim of his hat as he made no move to step inside despite the deteriorating weather. "May I have a word?" "Of course, Mayor. Please come in from the cold." Beth stepped aside, but Preston merely shuffled his feet, clearly intending this to be a brief conversation. "The town council met last night," he began without preamble, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We've been discussing your situation." Beth felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Since Thomas's death, her situation had become everyone's concern, except, apparently, in ways that might actually help her. "And what conclusion did the council reach about my private affairs?" she asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Preston's expression hardened. "Now, Beth, there's no call for that tone. We're looking out for your welfare, as Thomas would have wanted." The casual invocation of her husband's name stung like a physical blow. "Thomas would have wanted the contract he signed with this town to be honored," she replied. "He built half the furniture in that schoolhouse with the understanding that my position would be respected. The mayor shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward the town center as if seeking reinforcement. The situation has changed. Without Thomas's contributions, the arrangement is no longer practical. However, we believe we've found a solution. Beth waited, already suspecting what would follow. The Watson family is departing for Helena tomorrow. Franklin Watson has business connections there and believes they could find a place for you, perhaps as a governess or seamstress for one of the wealthy mining families. A seamstress? Beth echoed, disbelief sharpening her voice. Mayor Preston, I was brought to Riverdale to establish your school. I've taught your children literature, mathematics, and natural philosophy. I've introduced them to world history beyond these territories. And now you suggest I abandon my calling to sew dresses? Preston's face flushed red above his grey beard. The arrangement has always been temporary, Mrs. Caldwell. Mr. Hargrove will be arriving from Chicago in the spring to take over educational duties permanently. He gestured vaguely toward her small homestead. This is a generous offer. The Watsons are good Christians who think highly of you. Beth knew the Watsons. Margaret Watson had been the first to withdraw her children from school after Thomas's death, claiming the journey was too far in cold weather, but transparently uncomfortable with her children being taught by a woman in mourning. "And if I decline?" she asked quietly. Preston's expression grew stern. "Then I'm afraid the town cannot be responsible for what follows. Your supplies won't last through January, let alone the winter. Every family here has their own to feed, Mrs. Caldwell. There are limits to Christian charity." There it was, the threat wrapped in concern. Accept their disposal of her or face starvation alone. "I need time to consider," Beth said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The Watsons leave at first light," Preston replied, already turning away. "Pack lightly. Their wagon will be full." After he left, Beth closed the door and leaned against it, sliding slowly to the floor as emotion overwhelmed her. The small cabin Thomas had built with such care now felt like a trap closing around her. They had come west together, filled with idealistic notions of helping to build a community founded on education and shared prosperity. Now half of that dream lay buried in the churchyard, and the other half was being systematically dismantled by the very people who had once welcomed their contributions. Beth spent a sleepless night weighing her options. The practical part of her mind urged acceptance of the Watsons' offer. Helena was larger, with more opportunities and fewer memories. But her heart rebelled at the thought of traveling with a family who viewed her as a burden, destined for a position that would erase her identity as an educator. By morning, she had reached her decision. She would not go. When the Watson family's wagon rolled past her cabin without stopping, Beth watched through frosted windows, feeling equal measures of relief and trepidation. Had Mayor Preston even bothered to inform them of her refusal? Or had they simply assumed she wouldn't choose to join them? Either way, she was now alone with her decision and its consequences. The days that followed brought a punishing confirmation of Preston's warning. The temperature plummeted as a bitter cold front descended from Canada, transforming the early snowfall into a frozen crust that cracked underfoot. Beth's woodpile, already smaller than it should have been for the season, dwindled alarmingly. She had taken to wearing every piece of clothing she owned, layered against the cold that seemed to find every crack in the cabin's walls. On the fifth morning, she woke to find her water bucket frozen solid. The fire had died during the night, her supply of matches running low enough that she hesitated before lighting a new one. With trembling fingers, she dressed and forced herself outside to gather the last armload of firewood. The world beyond her door had transformed into something alien and menacing. Snow had drifted against the north wall of her cabin, nearly reaching the window. The path to town was completely obscured, though smoke rising from distant chimneys proved life continued there without her. As Beth struggled to carry the wood inside, a figure appeared at the edge of her property. For a brief moment, hope flared that someone from town had come to check on her welfare. Then she recognized the tall, imposing silhouette of Jeremiah Blackwood, the store owner who had extended credit to her after Thomas's death, credit that had run out weeks ago. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called, trudging through the deep snow toward her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Didn't expect to find you still here. Thought you'd gone with the Watsons." Beth clutched the wood tighter. "I declined their offer, Mr. Blackwood." Blackwood's weathered face registered surprise, then shifted to something closer to calculation. "That wasn't wise, Ma'am. Not wise at all." His gaze drifted to her dwindling woodpile, then back to her face. "I came to check if there might be anything of value left in the house. Mayor Preston mentioned you'd likely abandoned it, and there's the matter of your outstanding debt at my store." The audacity of his assumption that she would simply disappear, that her home and belongings would be forfeit, struck Beth like a physical blow. "This is my property, Mr. Blackwood. I've not abandoned anything." "Property requires payment of taxes, Mrs. Caldwell. Taxes I doubt you can manage come spring." His eyes narrowed. "As for your debt, I will settle my debt," Beth interrupted, summoning dignity despite her desperate circumstances. "But not by surrendering my home to scavengers." A dangerous look crossed Blackwood's face. "Careful with your words, Mrs. Caldwell. You've no protector now, and winter's just begun." He glanced meaningfully at her nearly empty woodpile. "Pride makes for cold comfort when the blizzards come." With that thinly veiled threat, he turned and trudged back toward town, leaving Beth shaking, partly from cold, partly from fury, and partly from the terrible knowledge that he was right. She had food for perhaps another week, firewood for 3 days if she was careful, and no prospects for obtaining more of either. That night, as temperatures plunged to new depths and wind rattled her windows with increasing ferocity, Beth faced the truth she had been avoiding. She would not survive this winter alone. The town had made its decision about her value, and that decision amounted to abandonment. In the darkest hours before dawn, Beth made a final, desperate plan. She would attempt to reach Cedar Ridge, some 18 miles to the northwest. It was a perilous journey in good weather, potentially fatal in these conditions, but remaining meant certain death. By first light, she had packed everything she could carry: a small amount of food, Thomas's hunting knife, carefully wrapped matches, an extra blanket, and his compass. She dressed in layers, wrapping a woolen scarf around her face and pulling on the fur-lined gloves Thomas had traded for last winter. As Beth stepped out into the bitter morning, a sense of finality washed over her. She might never see this home again, the home where she and Thomas had laughed and loved and planned their future. Tears threatened to freeze on her cheeks as she whispered goodbye to the life they had built and the dreams now buried with him. The journey began with a promise. Though the snow was deep, the storm had temporarily abated, leaving the landscape eerily still under a pale blue sky. Beth oriented herself using Thomas's compass, keeping the rising sun to her right as she pushed northwest towards Cedar Ridge. For the first few hours, determination drove her forward. She pictured the small but growing settlement that had established a proper schoolhouse last year, imagining herself finding purpose there, rebuilding her life among people who might value her skills. But as midday approached, clouds began gathering on the horizon, dark and ominous. The wind picked up, carrying the first biting flakes of a new storm. Beth quickened her pace, though fatigue had already begun to set in, her legs leaden from pushing through snow that sometimes reached her knees. By early afternoon, the storm had engulfed her completely, visibility reduced to mere feet in front of her, and the howling wind disoriented her sense of direction, even with the compass. Maintaining a straight course became nearly impossible, as she was forced to detour around deep drifts and obstacles hidden beneath the snow. "Keep moving," she urged herself, Thomas's voice seeming to echo in her mind. "To stop is to die." But as the short winter day began to fade, Beth realized with growing horror that she was lost. The landmarks she had tried to memorize from Thomas's maps were obscured by the blizzard. Worse, her strength was failing rapidly. Each step required more effort than the last, and a dangerous warmth began to spread through her limbs despite the plummeting temperature, the first warning sign of hypothermia that Thomas had once described. As darkness fell in earnest, Beth stumbled upon a small stand of trees, barely more than a dozen pines clustered together, but offering minimal shelter from the driving snow. With the last of her strength, she crawled beneath the lowest branches of the largest tree, huddling against its trunk and wrapping her blanket tightly around herself. "Just until the storm passes," she whispered, knowing even as the words left her lips that she was lying to herself. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, she had no clear idea of which direction to travel come morning. The cold penetrated her layers of clothing, and the blanket that had seemed so substantial in her cabin now felt paper-thin. Beth's thoughts turned to Thomas. Perhaps there was mercy in this end, a reunion with him beyond the veil of this life. Her eyelids grew heavy, the temptation to sleep nearly overwhelming. "Not yet," she murmured, forcing her eyes open. "Not like this." But nature cared nothing for human determination. The blizzard raged on, depositing snow around her impromptu shelter, gradually encasing her in a tomb of white. Beth's consciousness began to fade, her mind drifting into memories of warmer days, of students eager for knowledge, of Thomas's smile as he listened to her read aloud in the evenings. Just as her eyes closed for what she believed would be the final time, a sound penetrated the howling wind. Not the cry of wolves that she had feared might find her, but something rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps approaching through the storm. Beth forced her eyes open, straining to see through the curtain of snow. A dark silhouette materialized, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a confidence that defied the blizzard's fury. For a moment, her heart leapt with irrational hope. Thomas somehow returned to her, before reality reasserted itself. The figure paused, seemingly scanning the area, then moved with sudden purpose toward her hiding place. Beth shrank back against the tree, trunk, her numb fingers fumbling for Thomas's knife. The dangers of the wilderness extended beyond cold and starvation. Thomas had warned her of desperate men who roamed these territories, men to whom a lone woman would be merely another resource to exploit. The branches parted, and Beth raised the knife with a hand that trembled from both fear and cold. The figure froze, observing her defensive posture. Then a deep voice spoke, calm and measured despite the raging storm. "You are far from any settlement, pale woman." In the dim light filtering through the snow-laden branches, Beth could make out features that marked the stranger as Native American. His face, partially protected by a fur-lined hood, showed strength tempered by a watchfulness that seemed to assess her completely in a single glance. I lost my way," Beth managed to say, her voice raspy from cold and disuse. "I was trying to reach Cedar Ridge." The man regarded her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Cedar Ridge lies many miles west. This path leads only to death in the snow." "I know that now," Beth replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. She still held the knife, though her grip had weakened as the reality of her situation reasserted itself. This man, stranger though he was, represented her only chance at survival. He seemed to assess her condition with a practiced eye. "You cannot stay here. The cold has already begun to claim you." Beth knew he spoke the truth, the dangerous warmth spreading through her extremities, the confusion clouding her thoughts. These were the harbingers of freezing to death that Thomas had described from his own wilderness experiences. "Can you stand?" the man asked, his tone neither unkind nor particularly compassionate, merely practical. Beth nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain. As she attempted to rise, her legs buckled beneath her, numb from hours of immobility in the cold. Without comment, the stranger caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "My shelter lies to the north," he said. "Not far, but the journey will be difficult in your condition." He paused. "What is your name?" "Elizabeth," she replied, finding strange comfort in speaking it aloud after days of silence. "Elizabeth Caldwell." He nodded once. "I am called Swift Eagle among my people. The white traders who visit know me as Daniel." His dark eyes met hers directly. "You must walk if you can, Elizabeth Caldwell. I will guide you." With that simple declaration, Beth found herself entrusting her life to a man from a people she had been taught to fear, a man whose very presence in these territories represented resistance to the westward expansion that had brought her here. The irony was not lost on her, even in her weakened state. Daniel led the way, creating a path through the deep snow, occasionally reaching back to steady her when she faltered. He moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with this landscape, finding passages through drifts that would have been impossible for Beth alone. They traveled in silence, save for his occasional instructions. "Step here, watch your footing, rest a moment." Each delivered with the same economy of words that seemed to characterize everything about him. Beth concentrated on placing one foot before the other, on remaining upright, on following the broad back that represented her only hope of survival. After what seemed like hours, but might have been less, the storm began to abate slightly, allowing brief glimpses of the terrain around them. They had entered a more densely wooded area, the trees providing some shelter from the wind and snow. In the distance, Beth thought she glimpsed a faint glow. "We approach my winter camp," Daniel confirmed, noticing her change in attention. A path grows steeper here. Take care." Indeed, they began to ascend a gentle slope, the going more difficult as Beth's strength continued to wane. Twice she stumbled, and twice Daniel's strong hand caught her before she could fall. The third time, her legs simply refused to support her anymore, buckling beneath her as darkness edged her vision. Without a word, Daniel knelt beside her. "I must carry you now," he stated simply. "The cold has taken too much of your strength." Before Beth could protest, though what protest she could reasonably make, she wasn't sure, he had lifted her as easily as if she were a child, cradling her against his chest. The sudden warmth of another human body after hours of bitter cold sent a shock through her system, and she found herself instinctively curling closer, seeking the heat his sturdy frame provided. "My shelter lies just ahead," he reassured her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Hold fast, Elizabeth Caldwell. Your spirit is stronger than this storm." As consciousness faded and her head came to rest against his shoulder, Beth's last coherent thought was that perhaps death had indeed found her. But it had come in a form very different from what she had imagined. Not the cold embrace of winter, but the strong arms of a stranger whose kindness defied the boundaries between their worlds. Beth drifted through layers of consciousness, caught between the numbing embrace of winter and fleeting sensations of warmth. Her dreams were fragmented. Thomas calling her name, students reciting poetry, Mayor Preston's cold dismissal, and through it all, the howling of a storm that seemed to have no end. When awareness finally returned, it came in stages. First, the crackling of fire, then the scent of something rich and unfamiliar cooking, and finally, the realization that she lay wrapped in soft furs rather than frozen beneath a pine tree. She opened her eyes to find herself in a shelter unlike any she had seen before. Not a cabin in the traditional sense, but a partially underground structure. What she would later learn was called an earth lodge. The walls were formed from a combination of timber frames and packed earth, the ceiling low but solid, with a central opening where smoke from the fire pit rose. The entire space radiated a surprising warmth. Despite the storm, she could still hear raging outside. "You return to the living." The voice startled her. Daniel sat cross-legged on the opposite side of the fire, his hands busy with what looked like a hunting trap he was repairing. In the firelight, she could see his features more clearly, strong cheekbones, deep-set eyes that reflected the flames, hair worn longer than white men's, but tied back practically. He wore buckskin clothing adorned with subtle beadwork, functional rather than decorative. "How long?" Beth asked, her voice a rasp that barely carried across the small space. "3 suns," he replied, setting aside his work. "The fever of the cold took you. I thought perhaps your spirit had decided to journey onward." 3 days. She had lost 3 days to the cold. Beth attempted to sit up, only to find her limbs unnervingly weak, as if she'd suffered a long illness rather than simply slept. "Slowly," Daniel cautioned, rising to bring her a wooden cup filled with a steaming liquid. "Your body remembers the cold. It will take time to forget." The cup warmed her hands pleasantly as she inhaled the unfamiliar aroma, some kind of broth, with herbs she couldn't identify. When she sipped cautiously, the flavor surprised her. Rich and earthy, with a slight bitterness that was not unpleasant. "This is good," she murmured, taking another sip. "Thank you for this and for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the shelter, the fire, her continued existence. Daniel nodded once in acknowledgement, returning to his place by the fire. "The winter shows no mercy to those unprepared. Why did you travel alone in such weather?" The question was direct, without judgment, simply seeking information. Beth found herself explaining her situation. Thomas's death, the town's withdrawal of support, her desperate attempt to reach Cedar Ridge. Daniel listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Your people abandoned one of their own," he said when she finished, the statement flat but carrying an undercurrent of something not quite anger, but perhaps disapproval. "They saw no value in keeping me," Beth replied, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. A widow who teaches children has little purpose in their eyes. Daniel seemed to consider this. "The Lakota value wisdom and those who share it. A teacher would not be cast out, even among the poorest band." His words, though simply stated, carried a weight that made Beth's throat tighten with emotion. The validation of her worth, something Riverdale had systematically stripped away, came unexpectedly from a man whose people were portrayed as savages in the newspapers that occasionally reached their settlement. "The storm continues," Daniel said, changing the subject. 4 days now, the worst I have seen in many winters. Will your strength return soon?" "I believe so," Beth answered, suddenly conscious that she represented an additional burden on resources that had been meant for one. "Will your supplies last?" A hint of amusement crossed his face. "I prepare well for winter moons. My people do not settle in one place during warm seasons. We follow the buffalo, gather plants, dry meat and berries. Winter camps are stocked to last until spring thaw." He ladled more of the broth into a wooden bowl for himself, the firelight catching the careful craftsmanship of the utensil. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you are stronger, I will show you this place. It has been my winter camp for 4 seasons." Beth nodded, still overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have left me. Many would have." Daniel looked up from his meal, his dark eyes meeting hers directly across the fire. "Would you have left someone to die in the snow if you had the means to help them?" "No," Beth admitted. "But I'm not," she trailed, off uncertain how to express the thought without giving offense. "Not Lakota," he finished for her, his expression unchanged. "And I am not white, yet the storm does not ask what color skin freezes beneath it. The wolf does not care what language is spoken by the flesh it hunts. We are all simply human before the winter." The profound simplicity of his worldview silenced her. Beth finished her broth, feeling strength gradually returning to her limbs. As the day progressed, she drifted in and out of sleep, her body demanding rest to recover from its ordeal. Each time she woke, Daniel was engaged in some task, preparing food, mending equipment, carving what appeared to be a small wooden animal from a piece of pine. By evening, Beth felt well enough to sit up properly, wrapped in the fur blanket he had provided. The storm continued unabated outside, its howling a constant reminder of the fate she had narrowly escaped. Daniel prepared a more substantial meal, some kind of stew with dried meat and wild roots that tasted better than anything Beth had eaten since Thomas died. "Your shelter," she said as they ate. "It's remarkable. I've never seen anything like it." "It is a winter lodge," he explained. "Not our summer dwelling. Those are larger, made to be moved when we follow the buffalo. This is smaller, reinforced for winter storms. The earth and logs hold heat better than canvas in the deep cold." "You built this alone?" she asked, impressed by the craftsmanship. Daniel nodded. "4 winters ago. Each year I return, strengthen what has weakened, replace what has worn. It becomes stronger with time." Something in his tone suggested he spoke of more than just the shelter. Beth found herself curious about this man who lived between worlds, clearly maintaining Lakota traditions while also interacting enough with white settlements to speak excellent English and understand their ways. "You mentioned traders," she said cautiously. "Do you trade at Fort Bridger?" "Sometimes. I also guide for the army when they pay well. I understand the land, the weather, the movement of people. Information has value." His pragmatism surprised her. "Isn't that difficult, given the tensions between your people and the army?" Daniel's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, a complexity of emotion she couldn't decipher. "The world changes. The buffalo grow fewer. The white settlements spread like prairie fire. My band follows the old ways, but we must also understand the new ones to survive." He set down his empty bowl. "I learned your language at the mission school when I was young. Later, I served as translator for chiefs who spoke with army leaders. Now I walk between both worlds, trusted completely by neither." The loneliness implied by that statement resonated with Beth's own sense of displacement. She too existed in a space between expectations, too educated to be accepted as a proper frontier wife, yet unable to claim the professional status a man with her qualifications would receive without question. "That must be difficult," she offered quietly. Daniel made a non-committal gesture. "It is the path I walk. Each path has stones that bruise the feet." Their conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as the fire burned low. Outside, the storm seemed to gain new strength, the wind battering the lodge with fresh determination. Despite its fury, the structure held firm, barely trembling under the assault. "Will sleep come easier tonight?" Daniel asked, noting Beth's attention to the storm. "I think so," she replied, though in truth the howling winds still carried echoes of her near-death experience. "Though the storm's voice is difficult to forget, then listen to another voice instead," he suggested. To her surprise, he began to speak in a rhythmic cadence, words flowing in his native Lakota. Though she couldn't understand their meaning, the sound was mesmerizing, rising and falling like the prairie grasses under summer wind, strong yet soothing. "What is that?" she asked when he paused. "A winter story," he explained, "about how Coyote brought warmth to the people during the first winter. My grandfather told it on nights like this, when the wind tried to claim our attention." "It's beautiful," Beth said sincerely. Would you tell it in English? I'd like to understand." Something like approval flickered across Daniel's face. He settled more comfortably before the fire and began to translate the tale, his voice taking on the same rhythmic quality despite the change in language. Beth listened, entranced, as he wove the story of Coyote's cleverness, the anger of the winter spirits, and the gratitude of the people who received the gift of warmth. When he finished, the storm still raged, but Beth found she could hear it differently now, not as the voice of death narrowly escaped, but merely as the backdrop to this unexpected moment of connection across cultures. "Your people have many such stories?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Stories teach everything: how to live, how to hunt, how to respect the spirits, how to understand the world. They are how wisdom passes from grandparent to child." "Not so different from my work, then," Beth observed. "Teaching is about stories, too. The story of numbers and how they dance together, the story of words and how they build bridges between minds, the story of the past and how it shapes our present." For the first time, she saw Daniel smile, a brief softening of his usually stoic expression that transformed his entire face. "Perhaps teachers are valued among my people because we understand that stories carry life," he said. "Without them, we are merely flesh that walks and breathes." That night, Beth slept deeply despite the continuing storm, Daniel's story having replaced her fear with something approaching wonder. When she woke the next morning, she found the lodge quiet. The howling wind had finally ceased, and Daniel was absent, though his weapons still hung on their pegs. He hadn't gone far. With effort, she rose and dressed in her own clothes, which had been carefully dried and folded near her sleeping place. Her strength had returned considerably, though she still felt the lingering effects of her ordeal in trembling hands and aching muscles. The lodge's entrance flap moved aside, admitting a blast of cold air and Daniel carrying an armload of firewood. Frost rimmed his eyelashes and the fur of his hood, but his movements were as efficient and purposeful as ever. "The storm has passed," he announced, kneeling to rebuild the fire. "But the snow is deep, deeper than a tall man in some places where it has drifted." Beth's heart sank as the implications became clear. "Then Cedar Ridge is unreachable until the snow melts enough for travel," he confirmed. "Weeks, perhaps a moon or more." The reality of her situation settled heavily upon her. She was alive, yes, but still stranded, dependent on the continued goodwill of a man who owed her nothing, in a shelter barely large enough for one person, let alone two. "I've imposed on your kindness too much already," she began, but Daniel cut her off with a raised hand. "Winter is not a time for traveling alone," he said firmly. "That path leads only to death, as you have already discovered. You will remain here until safe passage is possible." His tone brooked no argument, though his expression remained free of resentment. He was simply stating what he saw as the only rational option. "How can I repay such generosity?" Beth asked, genuinely at a loss. Daniel considered her for a moment as he fed small sticks to the growing flames. "You are a teacher?" "Yes." "Perhaps you can teach." "Teach? But what could I—" "I speak your language," he interrupted, "but I do not read or write it well. These skills have value when dealing with white traders and army officers. They respect paper words more than spoken ones." Understanding dawned. "You want me to teach you to read and write English?" He nodded. "A fair exchange." I provide shelter and food. You provide knowledge, both necessary for survival. Put that way, it seemed perfectly reasonable. Beth found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in months. Yes, that seems fair, though I have no books, no paper. After we eat, Daniel said, returning to his practical manner, I will show you what is possible. Beth realized that Daniel's survival wasn't luck or simple instinct. It was the result of meticulous planning, accumulated knowledge, and constant awareness. As they completed their circuit and returned to the lodge, Beth found herself overwhelmed with gratitude, not just for her rescue, but for this glimpse into a way of life that respected and adapted to the land rather than attempting to conquer it. Thank you, she said simply as they removed their snowshoes at the lodge entrance, for sharing this with me. Daniel met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. You see with different eyes than most white women, he observed. You look to understand, not just to judge. Perhaps that's what teaching requires, Beth replied. The willingness to see the world through many different eyes. Inside the lodge, they settled by the rekindled fire. The copy of The Last of the Mohicans opened between them. As Beth began to assess Daniel's existing knowledge of written English, she realized that this unexpected winter arrangement offered something she had thought lost forever after Thomas's death and Riverdale's rejection: purpose. Here in this small shelter, far from any settlement, two people from vastly different worlds had found a connection based on the most fundamental of human activities: the sharing of knowledge. As the short winter day progressed into evening, and they continued their first lesson, Beth felt something within her begin to thaw, something that had frozen long before her desperate journey through the blizzard. Outside, the temperature dropped again as darkness fell. But inside the lodge, warmth emanated from more than just the dancing flames of the central fire. It radiated from the growing understanding between teacher and student, from the bridge, being built, word by careful word, across the divide of their different worlds. Days melded into a rhythm as December deepened its grip on the Montana wilderness. Beth and Daniel established a routine that made the most of daylight hours and the confined space they shared. Mornings began before dawn, with Daniel rekindling the central fire while Beth arranged their sleeping furs and prepared a simple breakfast from their carefully rationed supplies. Their days were filled with purposeful activity. There was no room for idleness in winter survival. Daniel taught Beth to maintain the earth lodge, showing her how to check the roof for areas where frost might accumulate, how to bank the fire, to provide maximum warmth with minimum fuel, and how to interpret subtle changes in the smoke's behavior. The smoke speaks to those who listen, he explained one morning, pointing to the thin column that bent sharply to the east before dispersing through the roof opening. Today brings clear skies, but bitter cold. By evening, the stars will seem close enough to touch. Beth marveled at these insights that came from generations of close observation, knowledge no textbook in her previous life had contained. In exchange, she devoted several hours each day to teaching Daniel to read and write English with greater proficiency. He proved to be a remarkably quick student, his existing knowledge providing a foundation she could build upon rapidly. Your mind grasps patterns quickly, she observed after he mastered a particularly difficult passage from The Last of the Mohicans. Many of my students in Riverdale would have struggled for weeks with what you've learned in days. Daniel considered this as he carefully transcribed sentences into the journal. Lakota children learn to read the land from earliest walking, where water flows beneath snow, which plants heal and which harm, how animals move before storms approach. Perhaps seeing patterns is not so different, whether in tracks on the ground or marks on paper. This perspective, drawing connections between his traditional knowledge and the new skills he sought, fascinated Beth. As a teacher, she had always believed in building bridges, between the familiar and the unknown. But never had she seen a student forge these connections with such natural insight. By the end of their second week together, Daniel could read substantial portions of text without assistance and write simple but clear messages. His progress gave Beth a sense of accomplishment she had sorely missed since losing her position at the school. In turn, Daniel's lessons extended beyond basic survival skills. He began teaching Beth to identify useful plants preserved in his carefully maintained storage, which roots could be used for medicine, which berries provided vital nourishment through winter months, and which herbs added flavor to otherwise bland, preserved foods. "This is bearberry," he explained one afternoon, showing her a small pouch of dried red berries, "good for fever and kidney sickness. This," he indicated another container with fragrant dried leaves, "wild mint clears the chest when breathing. Becomes difficult." Beth ran her fingers through the leaves, releasing their sharp, clean scent. "My mother used mint tea for chest colds," she remarked. "Some knowledge seems universal." Daniel nodded. "Many plants speak to all peoples in the same voice. Others keep their secrets unless approached with proper respect." He replaced the containers carefully. "When spring comes, I will show you how they grow, where to find them." The casual mention of spring, still months away, caught Beth by surprise. It implied a continuation of their association beyond the immediate crisis, something she had carefully avoided considering. What future awaited her when the snow melted? The question lingered, unasked but increasingly present, as December gave way to January. Their evenings established their own pattern. After the day's work and lessons concluded, they would share the main meal, carefully prepared to provide nourishment while conserving their stores. Then, as the fire burned low and darkness wrapped around the lodge, they would exchange stories, Daniel sharing Lakota legends that explained the origins of constellations or the changing seasons, Beth recounting tales from the books she had cherished since childhood or histories she had taught her students. On one such evening, as a particularly bitter cold snap held the prairie in its grip, Daniel asked a question that had apparently been on his mind. "The settlement that rejected you, were all your days there unhappy?" Beth looked up from the small piece of deerskin she was learning to soften using techniques Daniel had demonstrated. The question stirred memories she had been avoiding. "No," she admitted softly. "There were good days when Thomas was alive. We had purpose. The school was new, the children eager. Some parents valued education highly." She set aside her work, lost in recollection. The first Christmas at the school, the children performed a pageant. They had memorized poems and songs. Parents who barely spoke to each other put aside differences to attend. For that one evening, I glimpsed what the community could become at its best. Daniel listened attentively, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "And after your husband's passing?" Beth's expression clouded. Everything changed. It was as if his death gave permission for opinions that had been hidden to surface. The town council, all men of course, began questioning my methods, my curriculum. Parents who had praised my teaching suddenly worried about their children being instructed by a woman in mourning, as if grief somehow contaminated knowledge. "Your people fear death," Daniel observed matter-of-factly. "They hide it away, speak of it in whispers, as if it might be catching like fever." The insight struck Beth with its accuracy. "Yes," she agreed, "they treated me as if widowhood were a disease rather than a natural part of life's journey." She looked at him curiously. "The Lakota view death differently?" Daniel was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. "We do not welcome death before its time, but neither do we pretend it is not the companion of all living things. When a person walks to the spirit world, we honor their journey with ceremony. We keep their memory through stories. The living must continue living. This is how we respect Those who have gone ahead. The wisdom in this approach moved Beth deeply. No one in Riverdale had allowed her to speak of Thomas after the funeral. Mention of him brought uncomfortable silence or hasty changes of subject, as if remembering him might somehow prolong her grief rather than help her carry it. "Would you tell me about him?" Daniel asked unexpectedly. "The man whose absence shapes your path?" The simple invitation to remember, to share, to speak Thomas's name aloud broke something open inside Beth. Words began to flow, hesitantly at first, then with growing animation as she described the man she had loved, his skill with wood, his gentle humor, his belief in education despite having little formal schooling himself, his dreams of building a proper life on the frontier. Daniel listened without interruption, his face showing neither impatience nor discomfort as she spoke of love and loss with equal measure. When she finally fell silent, emotional but somehow lighter for having given voice to her memories, he offered no platitudes, only quiet acknowledgement. "He walks with the ancestors now, but his spirit lives in your words. This is good." That night, as Beth drifted towards sleep, wrapped in furs that kept the deepening cold at bay, she realized something had shifted between them. The simple act of bearing witness to her grief, neither minimizing it nor being consumed by it, had created a deeper level of trust than mere survival cooperation had established. The following morning brought a new challenge. Beth woke to find Daniel already dressed for outdoor travel, checking his hunting equipment with methodical care. "The meat stores grow low," he explained when he noticed her watching. "I must hunt today while the weather holds clear." Alarm flickered through Beth at the prospect of being left alone. Though she had mastered basic tasks around the lodge, the wilderness beyond remained a formidable threat, especially to someone raised in eastern settlements. Daniel seemed to read her concern. "You have learned much," he said reassuringly. "The fire will keep. The lodge will protect you. I will return before darkness falls." "Of course," Beth replied, embarrassed by her momentary panic. "What should I do while you're gone?" Daniel considered. "Practice the skills we have discussed. Prepare more of the inner bark strips for fiber work." He hesitated, then added, "And perhaps write in the journal. Your thoughts, your memories. Paper holds what the mind might lose." The suggestion surprised her, both for its sensitivity and its practicality. Daniel had come to understand her need for meaningful activity, not just physical tasks. After a brief meal and final preparations, he departed, snowshoes leaving distinct tracks that led away from the lodge and into the surrounding forest. Beth stood at the entrance until his figure disappeared among the trees, then turned resolutely to the day's tasks. She began by carefully feeding the central fire, adding wood in the pattern Daniel had taught her to maintain consistent heat. Next, she checked the lodge's perimeter, ensuring no weak points had developed in the structure. Satisfied with its condition, she turned to the inner bark strips that needed to be softened for future use in creating cordage. The repetitive nature of the work allowed her mind to wander. For the first time since her rescue, Beth found herself truly alone with her thoughts, without the immediate presence of her unexpected benefactor. She realized how quickly she had grown accustomed to his company, the quiet assurance he brought to every task, the unexpected insights that often emerged from his observations, even the comfortable silences that frequently settled between them. What would happen when winter released its grip on the prairie? The question that had hovered at the edges of her consciousness now demanded consideration. Her original plan to reach Cedar Ridge seemed both naive and increasingly unnecessary. The town had been merely a destination chosen out of desperation. She had no connections there, no guarantee of welcome. Beth paused in her work, struck by a realization. In the 6 weeks since Thomas's death, she had experienced more rejection than in her entire previous life, yet also more genuine acceptance. Daniel had offered shelter and knowledge without condition, seeing value in what she could contribute rather than limitations in what she could not. The contrast with Riverdale's treatment could not have been more stark. There, her education had become a liability after widowhood, her independence a threat to established order. Here, in a simple earth lodge miles from any settlement, her knowledge was respected, her capacity for learning new skills encouraged. As promised, she turned to the journal after completing her other tasks. The blank pages seemed intimidating at first. What thoughts deserved permanence? After hesitation, she began writing, not a structured narrative, but impressions and reflections, observations about the winter landscape, notes on skills she had learned, memories of Thomas that she wanted to preserve, and increasingly, thoughts about the man whose absence now felt tangible in the small shelter. The day passed more quickly than she had anticipated. When the light began to fade, Beth added more wood to the fire and moved to the lodge entrance, scanning the tree line for signs of Daniel's return. As minutes stretched into an hour with no sign of him, concern began to build. What if he had encountered trouble? A hunting accident, hostile travelers, or simply the unforgiving cold that could claim even the most experienced outdoorsman? Just as she was considering her limited options, she could hardly set out to search for him. A movement at the forest edge caught her attention. Daniel emerged from the trees, moving more slowly than usual, dragging what appeared to be a travois laden with his hunt. Beth quickly donned her outer garments and hurried to meet him, relief washing over her at his safe return. As she drew closer, she could see the reason for his labored pace. The travois carried a young elk, already field-dressed, but still a substantial burden to transport alone through deep snow. "Let me help," she called, reaching him as he paused to adjust his grip on the travois handles. Daniel looked up, surprise briefly crossing his features before he nodded, acceptance of her offer. Together, they managed the final distance to the lodge more easily, working in tandem to navigate the snow-covered ground. "Successful hunt," Beth observed as they reached the shelter. "The spirits were generous," Daniel agreed, his breath forming. "Clouds in the chill air. This will see us through many days." The use of us rather than me was not lost on Beth. Whatever their differences in background, experience, and culture, they had become a unit of sorts, bound by circumstance, but increasingly by choice as well. The next hours were consumed with processing the elk properly. Nothing could be wasted when survival depended on making maximum use of every resource. Daniel showed Beth how to help prepare the meat for preservation, explaining each step with patient detail. "The tendons will be dried for sinew," he demonstrated, carefully removing and setting aside specific parts. "Stronger than any thread your people make. The hide will need careful tanning, but will provide material for moccasins, perhaps a winter hood for you." Beth worked alongside him, initially clumsy, but increasingly confident as she followed his instructions. The work was messy and would have horrified the proper women of Riverdale, but she found satisfaction in its essential purpose. This was not genteel needlework to decorate a home. It was necessary labor that directly contributed to survival. As they worked into the evening, Beth described her day alone, including her time writing in the journal. Daniel listened attentively, seeming pleased that she had used the solitude productively. "Words on paper," he mused, as they finally settled by the fire, exhausted but content with the day's accomplishments. "My people keep our stories in memory, passed from one generation to the next. Your people trap words like animals, hold them still on pages." "I never thought of it that way," Beth admitted, intrigued by the comparison. "Is one better than the other?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "Different paths to the same destination. Memory breathes, changes with each telling. Writing stays fixed, but survives even when no one remains who remembers." He gestured toward the last of the Mohicans. Those words were set down before either of us walked this earth. The man who wrote them is long dead, yet his thoughts still speak. That's why I became a teacher, Beth said softly. Books allowed me to hear voices from the past, to learn from minds I could never meet in person. I wanted to give that gift to others. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Teaching is honored work among the Lakota. Those who know the old ways must share them, or the knowledge dies with them. He paused, then added, Perhaps when the snow melts, there will be children who would value your teaching. Lakota children, you mean? Beth asked, surprised by the suggestion. Some bands camp near Fort Bridger in spring. They trade meat and furs with officials. Daniel's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a question. Some seek to understand white ways, white words. A teacher who respects both worlds might find welcome there. The possibility stunned Beth, not because it seemed outlandish, but because it felt so unexpectedly right. Teaching had never been merely employment to her, but vocation. The idea that her skills might find purpose in a context she had never imagined was both disorienting and exhilarating. Would that be possible? She asked cautiously. A white woman teaching Lakota children. The path between worlds is never easy, Daniel replied, echoing words he had spoken before. But those who walk it create new possibilities. He added wood to the fire, watching the flames rise before continuing. Much would depend on the teacher, if she came with respect, with willingness to learn as well as teach. He left the thought, unfinished, but its implications hung in the air between them. Beth found herself imagining a future neither Riverdale nor her previous life had prepared her to envision, one where her identity as a teacher might continue, but in service to building understanding across the very boundaries that had seemed insurmountable before the winter began. As January progressed, their days fell into a pattern that balanced survival needs with increasing skills exchange. Daniel expanded Beth's instruction beyond basic wilderness knowledge to include Lakota perspectives on the land, seasons, and animals. He taught her simple phrases in his language, correcting her pronunciation with unexpected patience. In return, Beth's lessons ventured beyond reading and writing to include mathematics, geography, and history, subjects Daniel approached with the same pragmatic interest he showed in all forms of knowledge that might prove useful. Your people's numbers are powerful tools, he observed after mastering a particularly complex calculation. They allow counting of things not yet seen, planning for what has not yet happened. Mathematics helps us predict and prepare, Beth agreed. Though I think your weather prediction from watching smoke patterns may be more immediately useful in daily life than calculating geometric progressions. This drew one of Daniel's rare smiles, brief but genuine expressions that transformed his usually solemn countenance. These moments had become something Beth unconsciously worked toward, taking quiet satisfaction when her observations or occasional attempts at humor elicited this response. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a tear in one of the lodge coverings, Daniel unexpectedly asked, "Do you miss your old life, the settlement, the comforts of whites?" Beth's hand stilled on the sinew she was threading through carefully punched holes in the hide. The question required honest reflection. "I miss certain things," she acknowledged. "Books, primarily. My small library was precious to me. Volumes I'd collected since childhood, carried west at considerable effort." She resumed her stitching, considering further. "I miss the piano at the church, though I was only permitted to play it for Sunday services. And sometimes I miss conversations about ideas, about the wider world beyond these plains." Daniel nodded, accepting these answers, without judgment. "And people, beyond your husband's memory?" Beth's expression clouded. "There were a few. The blacksmith's wife who shared her bread recipes, 2 or 3 families who valued education enough to defend my teaching methods. But true friendship? That proved rarer than I expected. She tied off a length of sinew, her movements now practiced after weeks of learning. Riverdale revealed its true nature when adversity came. I cannot miss what was proven hollow. They worked in silence for several minutes before Beth gathered courage to ask her own question. And you? Do you miss your people when you winter alone? Daniel's hands remained steady at his task, but something shifted in his expression. A brief vulnerability quickly masked. My band travels with the seasons, following traditional ways. I chose a different path, learning white languages, serving as guide and translator, living between worlds. His voice held no self-pity, only a statement of fact. This creates distance. They disapprove? Beth asked gently. Some do. Others see necessity in having one who understands both sides. He secured the final stitches in the repair before adding, "My father was a respected warrior. He wished me to follow that path. When I chose knowledge over war, it created a shadow between us." The personal disclosure, rare from a man who spoke primarily of practical matters or traditional teachings, touched Beth deeply. She understood the courage required to choose one's own path against family expectations, her own decision to pursue. Higher education had created similar tensions, particularly with her mother, who had envisioned a more conventional life for her only daughter. "Yet you return to them," she observed. "They are my people," Daniel said simply. "Different paths do not change shared blood, shared history." He gathered the repaired hide, apparently considering his next words carefully. But perhaps there are many ways to honor one's people. Teaching their children to navigate the changing world might be one such way. The reference to their previous conversation about Beth potentially teaching Lakota children was unmistakable. The possibility had continued to develop in her mind over the intervening days, growing from abstract concept to potential future that both frightened and intrigued her. As they restored the repaired section of the lodge covering to its proper place, securing it against the still bitter January winds, Beth realized how much had changed in her perception of what constituted meaningful life. The comforts and conventions of her previous existence now seemed less essential than she had once believed. What remained vitally important was purpose, the opportunity to contribute, to share knowledge, to grow in understanding. Whether that purpose might be fulfilled among Lakota children near Fort Bridger, in some other settlement yet unknown, or perhaps even in continued association with the quiet, thoughtful man who had saved her life, remained unclear. But for the first time since Thomas's death and her subsequent abandonment, Beth felt something like hope when she contemplated the future. Not just survival, but the possibility of a life rebuilt on new and unexpected foundations. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing the day's final meal, a comfortable silence settled between them. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence of words, but from their diminished necessity. In the flickering light, Beth studied Daniel's profile as he gazed thoughtfully into the flames, struck by how familiar his features had become in the relatively brief span of their acquaintance. More than familiarity, she realized with a sudden clarity that both alarmed and exhilarated her. In this man, from a world so different from her own, she had found something she had not expected to discover again after Thomas's death. Connection that transcended mere circumstance, understanding that required no explanation, and perhaps most surprising, the first stirrings of feelings she had believed permanently extinguished by grief. The realization remained unspoken, held close, like the embers banked at night to preserve their heat until morning, but its warmth spread through her, bringing with it questions about what might be possible when winter finally released its grip on the land and on hearts that had begun to thaw in its deepest cold. January yielded reluctantly to February, The change of months bringing subtle shifts to the Montana landscape. The sun lingered longer in the sky, and though bitter cold still dominated most days, occasional afternoons brought hints of the distant promise of spring. During these briefer, milder interludes, Daniel expanded Beth's training beyond the immediate vicinity of the lodge, teaching her to recognize landmarks that would guide her safely if they became separated. "Always know your direction," he instructed, as they stood atop a small rise that afforded views across the snow-covered prairie. "Sun rises there," he pointed east, "sets there," gesturing west. "Stars above hold patterns that never change. Learn to read them, and you will never truly be lost." Beth absorbed these lessons eagerly, recognizing that he was preparing her for greater independence, though whether for eventual separation or partnership remained unspoken between them. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could have anticipated. Mutual respect had deepened into friendship, and friendship had begun to transform into something more complex that neither had yet acknowledged directly. On a particularly clear morning in mid-February, Daniel announced plans for a longer expedition than usual. "We must check the western ridge," he explained as they prepared. "Determine if passage toward Fort Bridger is becoming possible. Also, game may be moving as days grow longer. The journey would require most of a day, necessitating careful preparation." Beth helped pack essential supplies, food, extra layers against changing weather, basic tools, and emergency fire-starting materials. As they worked, she noticed Daniel, adding items he typically left behind for shorter excursions. His old army-issued binoculars, a small pouch of trading goods, and most notably, his rifle, meticulously maintained despite its age. "Do you expect trouble?" she asked, nodding toward the weapon. Daniel secured the rifle in its protective wrapping. A wise traveler prepares for what might happen, not only what is expected. The winter has been harsh. Hunger makes both animals and men unpredictable. His caution reminded Beth that despite their peaceful coexistence in this remote winter camp, the world beyond remained fraught with tensions between settlers and native peoples, between rival tribes, and sometimes between desperate individuals simply struggling to survive. They set out shortly after dawn, snowshoes still necessary for efficient travel despite slowly compacting drifts. Daniel set a measured pace that Beth could maintain without exhaustion, their breath forming clouds that dissipated in the crisp air. The landscape opened before them as they moved westward, rolling prairie dotted with stands of trees, occasional rocky outcroppings, and frozen streams that would become rushing waterways when the spring thaw finally arrived. Near midday, they reached the ridge Daniel had described, a long, sloping elevation that offered expansive views in all directions. To the west, Beth could make out the distant smudge of what might be smoke from Fort Bridger, though at such distance it was difficult to be certain. South and east stretched the seemingly endless prairie, broken only by watercourses marked by lines of trees following their frozen paths. Daniel surveyed the terrain methodically through his binoculars, paying particular attention to areas where game might be found or where travelers might pass. Beth watched his focused assessment, admiring the calm efficiency that characterized everything he did. "What do you see?" she finally asked when his survey seemed complete. He lowered the binoculars, expression thoughtful. "Snow begins to compact on southern slopes. In 2 weeks, perhaps 3, major trails will become passable." He pointed southeast. That direction, a herd of elk has moved into the valley. Good hunting soon. Then, turning west, his expression shifted subtly. And there, riders. Beth followed his gaze but saw nothing beyond the rolling terrain. Riders? How many? 3, too distant to identify. He handed her the binoculars, directing her gaze to a barely perceptible movement along what must be a trail, though it was indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape to her untrained eye. Through the lenses, she eventually located what he had spotted: tiny figures on horseback moving slowly but steadily in a northerly direction, roughly parallel to the ridge where they stood but still miles distant. Army patrols sometimes travel this season, Daniel explained, taking back the binoculars for another look. Or traders seeking early advantage. Sometimes Lakota scouts from other bands. He studied the riders a moment longer. Their path does not threaten our camp. Nevertheless, he seemed troubled by their presence, and they remained on the ridge longer than planned, watching until the distant riders disappeared from view behind a line of hills. During their return journey, Daniel maintained a heightened vigilance, occasionally pausing to listen or to study tracks they crossed. His caution communicated itself to Beth, who found herself scanning their surroundings with new awareness of potential dangers. "You're concerned about those riders," she observed, as they neared their camp late in the afternoon. Daniel adjusted his pack before responding. "Winter's end brings movement. Movement brings unexpected meetings. Not all such meetings are friendly. You think they might be hostile? Toward you or toward any they encounter, perhaps?" He glanced at her. "You have not seen the aftermath when fear and hatred guide men's actions." The gravity in his voice told Beth he spoke from personal experience. She had read newspaper accounts of conflicts between settlers and native tribes, but always from the settlers' perspective, with native peoples portrayed as the aggressors. Daniel's words hinted at a different reality she had never been allowed to consider. They reached the lodge without incident, but the day's observations had introduced a new element of caution to their previously isolated existence. That evening, as they prepared their meal, Daniel made a decision that surprised Beth. "Tomorrow we begin new lessons," he announced. "You must learn to use this." He indicated his hunting knife, a well-maintained blade with a bone handle worn smooth from years of use, "and to understand the rifle, though I hope you never need it." Beth's initial reaction was apprehension. She had never handled weapons before. Thomas had owned a rifle, but had taken responsibility for hunting and protection himself. The idea of learning such skills both intimidated and, she had to admit, intrigued her. "You think I might need to defend myself?" she asked. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "Knowledge harms no one. Ignorance can be fatal. A wise teacher understands this." His reference to her role as educator, applying her own principles to this unexpected curriculum, subtly eased her discomfort. If she truly believed in the value of knowledge, how could she reject learning skills that might prove essential? The following days introduced Beth to aspects of frontier survival that her previous life had sheltered her from. Daniel proved as patient and thorough in teaching these skills as he had been with all others. He began with the knife, showing her how to hold it properly, how to use it for practical tasks beyond food preparation, and with clear reluctance but firm resolve, how it could be employed for protection if absolutely necessary. "The knife is a tool first," he emphasized. "It creates before it destroys. Remember this." The rifle lessons were more complicated, not just physically, but emotionally for Beth. The weapon represented a power she had never wielded, the ability to affect life and death at a distance. Daniel sensed her discomfort and addressed it directly. "Among my people, those who hunt take no joy in killing. We thank the animal spirit for the gift of its flesh. Use every part with respect." He showed her how to load the rifle, how to aim properly, how to account for wind and distance. This knowledge does not require use, but not having it removes choice. Beth gradually overcame her initial reluctance, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. As with everything else he taught, Daniel emphasized understanding principles rather than simply memorizing actions. why certain precautions were necessary, how the mechanics of the weapon functioned, when its use would be justified and when it would not. These lessons continued alongside their regular activities, adding a new dimension to days already filled with practical skills development and their ongoing educational exchange. Daniel's proficiency with written English had helped him advance his reading and writing to levels that would serve him well in future dealings with settlers and officials. In turn, his instruction had transformed Beth from a helpless Easterner to someone who might, if not yet thrive, at least genuinely survive in the challenging Montana environment. Nearly a week after their observation of the distant riders, their relative peace was disrupted. Beth woke before dawn to find Daniel already dressed and alert, his rifle uncovered and close at hand. "What is it?" she asked immediately, sensing his tension. "Horses," he replied quietly. "3 riders approach from the west. They follow our tracks from yesterday's hunting." Beth felt a cold knot form in her stomach. After weeks of isolation, contact with others should have been welcome news. Instead, it felt like a threat to the world they had created together. "The same riders we saw from the ridge." Daniel moved to the lodge entrance, listening intently. "Perhaps they will reach our camp soon after sunrise. Prepare yourself, but show no fear. Fear invites aggression." Beth dressed quickly, her mind racing. If the approaching riders were army personnel, her presence as a white woman in a Lakota winter camp would require explanation. If they were traders or trappers, their reaction to finding her here was unpredictable at best, and if they were Lakota from another band, her presence might create complications for Daniel she could only begin to imagine. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the smoke hole, Daniel made a decision. "We will meet them outside, not within our shelter. It shows confidence." He handed Beth his second-best knife, which she secured at her waist as he had taught her. "Follow my lead. Speak only when necessary." They positioned themselves near the entrance to the lodge, a small fire burning before them, presenting an image of calm readiness rather than alarm. Daniel stood slightly ahead of Beth, his rifle held casually but accessible, his posture neither threatening nor submissive. The sound of approaching horses became audible, 3 sets of hooves moving at a walk through snow that had hardened enough to support their weight without completely masking the sound of their passage. Minutes later, 3 riders emerged from the tree line that partially sheltered the winter camp. Beth's first impression was one of mismatched companions. The lead rider was clearly a white man, heavily bearded, wearing a battered army coat over civilian clothing, his horse larger than the others and equipped with a standard military saddle. Behind him rode a younger man, also white, thin-faced, and wary-eyed. The third rider, slightly separated from the others, was native, not Lakota, Beth thought, noting differences in his clothing and appearance from what Daniel had described of his people. The lead rider halted at a respectful distance, raising an empty hand in greeting. "Ho, the camp," he called in a voice roughened by weather and tobacco. His gaze moved from Daniel to Beth, surprise evident in his expression. "Well now, this is unexpected company indeed." Daniel responded with a measured nod, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "You travel early in the season," he observed in English, his tone neutral. The bearded man dismounted, motioning for his companions to remain on horseback. "Winter breaks early this year. We're headed to Fort Bridger before the spring rush." His attention remained fixed on Beth, curiosity and something less definable in his gaze. "Marcus Sullivan," he introduced himself, not extending a hand, but offering a slight bow. "My companions are Levi Thornton and Gray Fox." He gestured to the younger white man and the native rider respectively. Beth noted that the one called Gray Fox showed no reaction to being introduced, his expression as impassive as Daniel's. "I'm Elizabeth Caldwell." she responded, deciding directness was preferable to allowing speculation. Mr. Redfeather rescued me during the January blizzards when I became separated from my traveling party. The half-truth seemed safer than explaining her abandonment by Riverdale or her subsequent choice to remain with Daniel rather than seek return to white settlement at the first opportunity. Sullivan's eyebrows rose. Remarkable indeed. Your family must be beside themselves with worry. Ma'am, we'd be honored to escort you to Fort Bridger when you're ready to travel. The offer, though phrased courteously, carried an assumption Beth found presumptuous, that she naturally wished to return to white society at the first opportunity, and that Daniel's assistance had been merely temporary expediency rather than the beginning of a more complex relationship. Before she could respond, Daniel spoke. The trails remain dangerous for inexperienced travelers. When safer passage is possible, Mrs. Caldwell will decide her own path. Beth felt a surge of gratitude for his subtle support, affirming her agency. Without directly challenging Sullivan's assumptions, Sullivan studied Daniel with new interest. You speak excellent English, friend. Educated at the mission school, were you? I learned in many places, Daniel replied evenly. Knowledge has value regardless of its source. A smile spread beneath Sullivan's beard, though it didn't reach his eyes. Well said. You must be quite the scholar out here in the wilderness. He turned back to Beth. Though I imagine you've been eager for civilized conversation after months with only limited company. The dismissive implication raised heat in Beth's cheeks. On the contrary, Mr. Sullivan, I found our conversations most edifying. Mr. Redfeather's knowledge of this territory, its history, and its natural properties far exceeds anything I learned in Eastern schools. Sullivan seemed taken aback by her defense, reassessing the situation with narrowed eyes. I see, he said finally. Well, regardless, we'd be pleased to carry any messages to Fort Bridger for you. Perhaps there are people who should know of your situation. The loaded pause made Beth's skin crawl. Sullivan clearly found her presence in a Lakota winter camp scandalous, her apparent comfort with the arrangement even more so. His offered assistance carried implicit judgment and threat. Daniel had evidently reached similar conclusions. We thank you for the offer, he said with formal politeness that created distance rather than connection. Our supplies are sufficient and we require no assistance at present. Sullivan glanced between them, something calculating entering his expression. Of course, but since we've happened upon your camp, perhaps you might offer traditional hospitality. Coffee or a meal would be welcome after hard riding. The request placed Daniel in a difficult position. Lakota custom dictated generosity toward travelers, yet every instinct warned that allowing these men closer access to their camp and to Beth would be unwise. We can offer coffee, Daniel decided after a moment's consideration. Our supplies allow little more. He gestured Beth back toward the lodge with a slight nod, clearly intending her to prepare the coffee while he remained watchful of their visitors. Beth understood immediately, retreating to the shelter where she could move the small kettle they used for coffee over the internal fire. Through the partly open entrance flap, she could see Daniel maintain his position, keeping himself between the visitors and the lodge. Sullivan dismounted, instructing his companions to remain on horseback. Fine animal you have there, he commented, nodding toward Daniel's horse, tethered in a sheltered area nearby. Army issue, if I'm not mistaken. Payment for guiding services? Yes, Daniel replied without elaboration. Inside the lodge, Beth worked quickly, her hands steady despite her inner turmoil. Something about Sullivan disturbed her deeply. Not merely his obvious prejudice, but a calculating quality beneath his superficial courtesy. As she prepared the coffee using their precious supply of beans, she listened intently to the conversation. Outside. Do you guide for the army regularly? Sullivan was asking, his tone falsely casual. When the terms are fair, Daniel answered. Useful skills, knowing the territory, especially now with so many changes coming. Sullivan's voice lowered, Slightly, though still audible to Beth. Gold in Thunder Basin has folks excited. The army can barely keep settlers from rushing in before the treaties are properly adjusted. The emphasis on the last word sent a chill through Beth. Thunder Basin was sacred to the Lakota, protected by treaty from white encroachment. Adjustment could only mean one thing: violation of those guarantees. Daniel's response was measured. Treaties signed in good faith should be honored by all parties. Sullivan laughed, a harsh sound without humor. That's a fine sentiment, friend. Truly. But we both know how these things go. Progress can't be stopped by pieces of paper. He lowered his voice further. Smart Indians know which way the wind blows. Position themselves accordingly. The attempted manipulation was as transparent as it was offensive. Beth had heard enough. Gathering the coffee pot and the few cups they possessed, she emerged from the lodge, interrupting whatever response Daniel might have made. "Coffee's ready, gentlemen," she announced with forced brightness, taking control of the interaction through the familiar rituals of hospitality she had observed countless times as a teacher in Riverdale. "I'm afraid we have no sugar to offer." Sullivan accepted a cup with exaggerated courtesy. "Much obliged, Mrs. Caldwell. Been a while since I've had coffee served by a lady's hand." Beth smiled tightly, serving Daniel next before offering cups to the other two men who had finally dismounted but remained close to their horses. The young white man, Thornton, accepted with a mumbled thanks, avoiding eye contact. Gray Fox declined, with a slight shake of his head, his gaze fixed somewhere in the distance. As they drank the coffee, Sullivan resumed conversation, now directing his attention primarily to Beth. "You mentioned being separated from your traveling party, Mum. Might I ask where you were bound?" "Cedar Ridge," Beth replied, sticking to her earlier narrative. "My late husband's cousin has a property there." Late husband. Sullivan's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. "My condolences, Ma'am. Recently widowed, then?" "Last autumn," Beth answered, keeping her responses brief to discourage further personal inquiries. "Such a tragedy, and now this ordeal." Sullivan shook his head. "Providence works in mysterious ways, though, bringing you to safe harbor." His gaze flicked to Daniel and back to Beth. Temporary safe harbor, of course. The implication was clear. Sullivan considered her current arrangement both inappropriate and necessarily short-term. Beth felt Daniel tense beside her, though his expression remained impassive. "Providence indeed, Mr. Sullivan," she agreed pleasantly. "I found exactly the guidance I needed during this difficult time." Sullivan studied her over the rim of his cup, reassessing. Beth could almost see him adjusting his approach as he realized she might not be the distressed damsel eager for rescue that he had initially assumed. "Well," he said finally, draining the last of his coffee, "we should be on our way if we hope to make decent progress before sunset." He returned the cup to Beth with a nod. "Much obliged for the hospitality." As the men prepared to depart, Sullivan turned to Daniel with a parting observation that carried a thinly veiled warning. "The Army's been having trouble with renegade Crow harassing settlements south of Fort E. Bridger, been authorized to deal with any suspicious activity rather firmly. Might want to keep that in mind if you're traveling in the coming weeks." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the information without comment. His stillness, Beth had learned, often masked his most intense reactions. The three riders mounted their horses, Sullivan tipping his hat to Beth with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, should you decide you're ready for more civilized accommodations, we'll be at Fort Bridger for at least 2 weeks before heading east. Happy to escort you to Cedar Ridge or wherever else you might wish to go." "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sullivan," Beth replied with matching formality. "Safe travels." They watched in silence as the riders departed, following the trail that led westward toward Fort Bridger. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Daniel's posture relax slightly, though concern remained evident in his features. What do you make of them? Beth asked once they had retreated inside the lodge. Daniel secured the entrance flap before responding. The bearded one, Sullivan. He speaks with many tongues. One for you, one for me, another for what he truly thinks. He added wood to the central fire, his movements deliberate. The young one fears his own shadow. The third, Grey Fox, is Crow, not Lakota. Traditional. Enemies, though such distinctions matter less now, with all tribes facing the same threats. Sullivan's remarks about Thunder Basin troubled me, Beth admitted, and his warning about the army dealing with suspicious activity. Not a warning, Daniel corrected. A threat. He disapproves of what he found here. His gaze met hers directly. A white woman living willingly with a Lakota man violates boundaries. He holds sacred. The blunt assessment hung between them, explicitly acknowledging what they had both understood but rarely verbalized, that their growing connection transcended mere survival cooperation, becoming something neither Sullivan nor most of white society would sanction. Will they cause problems? Beth asked. Daniel considered the question carefully. Sullivan is a man who sees opportunity in everything. If reporting your presence here benefits him, he will do so without hesitation. Then perhaps I should go to Fort Bridger, Beth suggested reluctantly. Establish my own narrative before he can create one that damages us both. Perhaps, Daniel acknowledged, but not yet, and not alone. Sullivan's words about Renegade Crow may be true or false. Either way, the threat is real. Army patrols will be watching for any native travelers, especially those accompanied by whites. The implications were clear. Travel now would be dangerous for both of them, albeit for different reasons. Daniel would be vulnerable to suspicious army patrols. Beth would be subject to judgment and potentially forced rescue if found in his company. What do you suggest? She asked, trusting his assessment of their situation. We wait, watch, prepare. He checked the securing of the entrance flap again, a small gesture that revealed his heightened vigilance. Sullivan travels to Fort Bridger, not away from it. If he speaks of finding you here, it will be to army officers who cannot leave their posts without orders. Such orders take time. Beth nodded, seeing the logic in his analysis. So we have time to consider our options. Yes, Daniel's expression softened slightly. And you have time to decide which world you wish to return to, if either. The quiet statement acknowledged the choice that had been forming in Beth's mind since long before Sullivan's unwelcome appearance. Whether to return to white society with its comforts and constraints, remain in some capacity among the Lakota, despite the challenges such a choice would entail, or perhaps forge a path that somehow incorporated elements of both worlds. That evening, as they prepared for sleep, the usual, comfortable silence between them had been replaced by a watchful tension. Daniel checked his rifle one final time before setting it within easy reach, a precaution he hadn't taken since the worst of the winter storms. You don't trust them to simply continue to Fort Bridger, Beth observed. I trust what I have seen and known, not what strangers claim. He arranged his sleeping furs nearer to the entrance than usual. Sullivan's eyes showed interest beyond. Simple curiosity. The Crow warrior watched too carefully. Only the young one seemed as he appeared, nervous and out of place. The assessment matched Beth's own impressions, though she lacked Daniel's experience in reading potential threats. As she settled onto her sleeping platform, exhaustion competed with anxiety, making rest elusive despite the physical demands of the day. Sleep, Daniel encouraged, noting her restlessness. I will keep watch first. We will take turns through the night. The simple "we" carried more comfort than any elaborate reassurance could have provided. Whatever threat Sullivan and his companions might represent, they would face it together. Not as rescuer and rescued, but as partners who had chosen each other's company when all external pressures would have separated them. Beth closed her eyes, finding unexpected calm in that knowledge. The world beyond their small shelter might judge, threaten, or attempt to sever the connection they had formed, but it could not erase what had grown between them during the winter's enforced intimacy. Trust that transcended cultural differences, respect that defied social expectations, and something deeper that neither had yet fully named, but both increasingly acknowledged. In the final moments before sleep claimed her, Beth realized with perfect clarity that regardless of Sullivan's intentions or the complications his discovery might create, she had already made her choice about which world she wished to inhabit. It was neither the restrictive society she had left behind, nor a complete abandonment of her own cultural identity, but something new. A life built at the intersection of two worlds with a man whose quiet strength and profound wisdom had transformed her understanding of what truly mattered. The challenge now would be defending that choice against those who would deny her right to make it, a battle that had just begun with Sullivan's unwelcome appearance and would likely intensify in the coming days as winter's grip on the Montana. Plains finally began to loosen. The day after Sullivan's visit dawned clear but tense, with both Beth and Daniel moving through their morning routines with heightened vigilance. Sleep had come in shifts through the night, neither willing to leave them completely vulnerable, despite Daniel's assessment that immediate danger was unlikely. Now, as pale sunlight filtered through the smoke hole of the lodge, they faced the practical implications of having been discovered. "We should prepare for swift departure if necessary," Daniel announced as they finished a simple breakfast. "What cannot be carried must be hidden or abandoned." Beth nodded, surveying their small, shared world with new eyes. The winter months had accumulated more possessions than she'd realized. Tools she'd learned to use, clothing adapted to the harsh climate, the small but precious educational materials they'd employed in their knowledge exchange. Each item now required evaluation through the harsh lens of potential flight. "How soon might we need to leave?" she asked, already mentally categorizing their belongings into essentials and expendables. Daniel considered, his expression typically measured despite the circumstances. "Not immediately. Sullivan reaches Fort Bridger today or tomorrow. If he reports our presence to authorities, they will not act without deliberation. Army commanders dislike unnecessary movement of troops, especially as spring thaw approaches. But they will come eventually," Beth concluded. "Perhaps," he began gathering his most essential hunting and survival tools. "Or perhaps Sullivan's interest lies elsewhere. His words about Thunder Basin suggest a man seeking opportunity, not justice." Beth recalled Sullivan's thinly veiled references to gold and treaty adjustments with growing unease. "You think he might be prospecting illegally in Lakota territory? Men like Sullivan walk where profit leads regardless of boundaries or laws." Daniel secured his knife at his belt with practiced efficiency. "Today we will scout southward. If others like him travel these lands, we should know their numbers and directions." They departed within the hour, the lodge secured against both weather and potential intruders. Essential emergency supplies were cached in locations only they knew. Beth had become proficient enough with snowshoes that she maintained a reasonable pace alongside Daniel, though his natural efficiency of movement still far exceeded her recently acquired skill. By midday, they had reached a vantage point that offered views across miles of snow-covered prairie. From this elevated position, Daniel pointed out 3 separate small parties moving through the territory, all heading toward Thunder Basin. "More traffic than usual for this season," he noted with concern. "Word spreads about gold. Like insects to honey, they come." As they began their return journey, Beth found the courage to ask the question that had been growing in her mind since Sullivan's visit. "When we reach Fort Bridger, what will you tell them about us?" Daniel paused, considering her question with characteristic thoughtfulness. I will tell them truth, that we found strength together when separate paths meant death. That wisdom, shared, creates bonds stronger than those imposed by custom. And if they refuse to understand that truth, Beth pressed. His dark eyes met hers directly. Then we find those who will. The Reverend Miller at the fort sees with clearer eyes than most. His wife Martha works among both peoples. A rare smile softened his features. Not all whites believe the world must remain divided. They reached the lodge by late afternoon, confirming that no one had approached it during their absence. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of dried elk meat with preserved berries, Daniel made an unexpected proposal. "Tomorrow we should practice your riding," he said. "If we must journey to Fort Bridger soon, you must be comfortable on horseback for long distances." Beth nodded, recognizing the practical necessity, though she had limited experience with horses. "Do you think Sullivan will force our hand?" "The snow melts more each day," Daniel replied. "Whether by choice or necessity, we will need to leave this place soon. Better to decide our moment than have it decided for us." The following morning brought new urgency to their preparations. Beth woke to find Daniel already outside, tending to his horse with unusual attention. When she joined him, the reason became clear. Fresh tracks in the snow surrounding their camp made sometime during the night. "Someone watched us," he explained quietly, indicating footprints that circled the lodge but never approached directly. "One man on foot, careful to stay in shadows. Sullivan returning." Daniel shook his head. "Different boot, smaller man." He finished preparing the horse. "Today we ride, not just for practice. We need to see who watches and how many they are." Beth's riding lesson became a wide reconnaissance circuit. Daniel placed her before him on the horse, his arms around her to hold the reins, showing her how to balance with the animal's movements. Despite the circumstances, Beth found herself acutely aware of his closeness, his steady presence at her back as they traversed the rolling terrain surrounding their winter shelter. They discovered what Daniel had feared: signs of multiple observers, tracks from at least 3 different individuals converging on vantage points that offered clear views of their lodge. "Trappers, perhaps," Daniel suggested, though his tone indicated he believed otherwise. "Or Sullivan left men to watch while he continues to Fort Bridger." By late afternoon, the situation clarified itself in the worst possible way. Returning to their camp, they spotted smoke rising from their lodge. Not the controlled plume of their cooking fire, but the billowing clouds of deliberate destruction. Daniel urged the horse forward, reaching the edge of the clearing, in time to see 3 men mounting their horses some distance from the now burning structure. One raised a hand in mocking salute before they galloped away. Even at this distance, Beth recognized Sullivan's distinctive beard. "Everything we had," she whispered, watching as the flames consumed the shelter that had protected them through the winter. Daniel's expression remained impassive, but his arm tightened around her. "Waste, not everything," he corrected softly. "We still have knowledge shared between us. We have cached supplies. We have each other." He guided their horse toward one of the hidden supply caches rather than the burning lodge. "Sullivan clears his trail," he explained as they collected essential provisions. "Men who violate treaties fear witnesses. He reports you kidnapped, perhaps, or killed by savages. Makes his own activities less noticed." "What do we do now?" Beth asked, forcing practicality. Through her shock, "We ride for Fort Bridger immediately," Daniel decided. "Sullivan does not expect us to follow. He believes he has left us stranded without shelter as winter's last storms approach." His eyes met hers. "Are you willing to travel hard with little rest?" Beth's answer came without hesitation. "I'm ready." They traveled through the remaining daylight and into the night, Daniel guiding them by starlight along trails Beth could barely discern. The horse carried them steadily southwest toward Fort Bridger and whatever reception awaited them there. They paused only briefly near dawn, melting snow for drinking water and sharing the last of their preserved food. Beth's muscles ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, but she voiced no complaint. Daniel's face showed the strain of vigilance, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for pursuers or other threats. "We should reach the fort by nightfall," he told her as they resumed their journey. "What happens there depends on who hears. Our story first, Sullivan or us? And if Sullivan has already poisoned the well against us?" Daniel considered this as he helped her remount. "Then we find those who will listen. Truth speaks with its own voice to those who hear clearly." The day passed in steady travel, the landscape gradually changing as they descended toward the river. The valley where Fort Bridger stood. By late afternoon, they could see smoke from the settlement rising against the sky. Beth felt a curious mixture of apprehension and determination. The civilized world she had left behind now loomed before them, with all its comforts and all its prejudices. "Whatever happens," she said, as they paused on the final ridge overlooking the fort, "I want you to know that I wouldn't trade these months with you, even for all the security Riverdale once offered." Daniel's hand found hers, a rare gesture of open affection. "Some paths appear only when snow covers the usual trail," he said softly. "Sometimes these new paths lead to better places." They approached the fort as twilight gathered, aware of the attention they drew. A Lakota man and white woman riding double, emerging from the wilderness after the harshest winter in years. Armed guards at the gates straightened as they approached, rifles shifting to ready positions. "State your business," the lead guard called, eyeing Daniel with obvious suspicion. Before Daniel could respond, Beth spoke clearly and with confidence she had rediscovered during their months together. "I am Elizabeth Caldwell, survivor of Riverdale. This is Daniel Redfeather, who saved my life when my community abandoned me. We've come to report a criminal named Marcus Sullivan, who burned our winter shelter and is illegally prospecting in treaty territories." The guard's eyebrows rose at her direct manner. "Ma'am, there's a Sullivan who arrived yesterday claiming a Lakota brave had kidnapped a white woman." "Then he's added lying to his crimes," Beth interrupted. "Please inform Colonel Montgomery that we request an immediate audience. This matter concerns not only justice for us, but the peace of the entire territory." As the guards conferred among themselves, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You speak with the voice of two worlds now," he murmured. "Neither can dismiss you easily." Beth nodded imperceptibly. The path ahead remained uncertain, but they would walk it together, a teacher and a hunter who had discovered that wisdom shared could bridge the deepest divides, even as the world around them tried to tear such bridges down. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.